Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, Newcastle Council's leader has defended the way the city is tackling sexual exploitation. A serious case review has been launched after 18 people were convicted in an investigation involving hundreds of victims. The police have been criticised for using a convicted child rapist as an informant, and authorities have been accused for failing to tackle the problem within particular communities. Our Home Affairs correspondent Mark White spoke to the leader of Newcastle City Council and asked him what he thought councils are doing there to reach out to certain communities in the city.
We know that abuse takes many forms. It can happen within a family environment, it can happen between strangers, it can happen in this case between networks of people who knew each other. And what we have to do is make it absolutely clear that this kind of behaviour is unacceptable in any community.
What are you doing, though, to reach out to this community?
I don't want to target any particular community.
But isn't that the problem, where no one in authority has been willing to step up and actually say there is a particular problem in a certain community? It's been swept under the carpet.
It's not being swept under the carpet here. We've been absolutely rigorous in rooting this out. There are a minority of people who come from a certain part of the city who've been involved in this abuse, and we have.
But you won't even say it there, will you? You won't even say that, you know, they're from the Bangladeshi and Pakistani predominant
these are people
community.
These are people from a whole range of communities,
but not in this instance. Not in the
Iraqi,
instance we're talking
Irani.
about.
And in this instance, these are people who knew each other through a variety of networks. What we've been doing is disrupting those networks, and we will continue to do so. But what we have to do is build a culture and a sense where women are treated with equality and with dignity. And as long as we have some sections of some communities who don't see women as equals, then we will continue to see this kind of abuse. And that's why it's absolutely crucial that we do a whole range of work with a whole range of people, health workers, police workers, our schools, people right across our communities,
mosques,
including our volunteer groups, including our mosques. Of course, we've been talking to our mosques. We've been talking to all of our faith leaders. But it's
quite striking that you don't mention mosques when this was an issue where pretty much every one of those offenders that we're talking about was Muslim.
Is the fact that they've preyed on vulnerable people.
And they're Muslim.
We don't know that they're Muslim.
Well, we do actually.
Do you?
Yes.
It was not part of the trial, it was not mentioned as part of the trial. The thing that has linked these people is places like where they work, some of the social networks that they move in. These are people on the margins of criminality. These are people who've been dealing drugs. These are people who've been abusing women. That is not part of any mainstream religion, and none of the faith leaders have in any way condoned any of these actions. And as leader of this city, I am absolutely determined to drive this kind of behaviour out of our communities. And we will continue to be absolutely ruthless in seeking it out, in making sure that it is not acceptable, and in also ensuring that victims are given the support they need to be heard and to be believed and supported through the justice system.
For more on this now, we can speak to Stuart Kirby. He's a Professor of Policing and Criminal Investigation at the University of Central Lancashire with a PhD on child sex offenders, and he's also a former Detective Chief Superintendent at the Lancashire Constabulary. Very good afternoon to you, Stuart. I'm not sure if you were able to hear that interview that Mark White was conducting there with the leader of Newcastle City Council, but it just strikes me that there were echoes of some of the criticisms that we heard from Theresa May, the then Home Secretary, to the local authorities, that there was a sense of institutional political correctness that had hampered investigations. Do you think that in this case that is applicable?
Sorry, I didn't hear the interview, and I'm perhaps not the best person to ask in terms of politics. I'm a criminologist and somebody who studies policing. I would say that child sexual exploitation is apparent across the world, and I think the issue is trying to eradicate it through supporting victims to come forward and taking the investigations very seriously wherever it may occur.
So just to be clear, that you think that the best way to tackle it is by supporting the victims and not by going to the grassroots community level and trying to tackle it there?
Oh, I do, very much so. I think the best informants in the country are the people who are close to these issues in the community, and they will see things, and that's true of most particular crimes. Trying to get the community to come forward rather than to look the other way when they think something is suspicious is happening is really, really important in this case and in other cases.
We're talking about British, Pakistani and Bangladeshi, primarily convicts in this case. A lot of people saying that the communities were not willing to come forward, were not willing to report incidents or concerns that they might have. So how do you tackle such closely knit communities that have a reticence to discuss these kinds of things?
This is an issue across the world, and there's been many studies in terms of policing around better engagement, and I think what's becoming very apparent is that policing is a much wider issue than the police on their own, and local councils, housing, social services, all these people, the closer they can work together, the more they can engage with communities, the more that when they get complaints, they can do something very positive about them and feed that information back. That they are the things that increase confidence in the community and make them more likely to come forward.
What do you make about the use of a convicted sex offender as an informant in Operation Sanctuary? There'll be people who are concerned that it might have led to him reoffending, or it could still do that, and the fact that he was paid £10,000 by the police was a sort of morally abhorrent.
It's a really, really difficult issue, and the people making these judgments are very accountable for them. I think to say that you'd never use a rapist as an informant, that's something I don't think a lot of people would agree with. Say that rapist had information about a child that was about to be murdered, would we say we wouldn't take that information? And I think that's the issue with informants. It's always about proportionality. So in this particular case, as with all informants, they can give very accurate information that can get to the core of a particular issue, and also it can save a lot of collateral intrusion to other people who aren't involved, so they can provide very accurate information. But these moral judgments are really, really difficult, and that's why in this country the informant system is just so accountable. So what the police have got to show is that using an informant in this case provided information that couldn't have been obtained through any other conventional means. And the accountability is...
that's the case in this particular operation? Do you think that the police really couldn't have got to these convictions without this informant, or do you just think it would have taken longer?
Well, that's the question to be answered, and the level of information that the police will have in that area are that they're the only people who can answer that question. But very often, you know, things like surveillance would never get the information that an informant can offer in these particular circumstances.
OK, Stuart Kirby, Professor of Policing and Criminal Investigations at the University of Central Lancashire. Thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Let's get more now on the police investigation into sexual exploitation in Newcastle. Andrew Norfolk is the Times journalist who uncovered the original scandal in Rotherham. He joins us now from Leeds. And I have to say, hundreds of victims involved in this. How was it that nobody within the community reported exactly what was going on to the police?
There's been a long-standing history of failure to acknowledge, failure to report, failure to tackle in towns and cities, the length and breadth of England. Newcastle was no exception there. It's merely realised what was going on rather later than many other places.
And I spoke to a local councillor earlier who is a Muslim himself. He said, as a Muslim, he has received a lot of abuse for speaking out on this subject. Do you think certain groups are now being blamed for what's gone, even though, of course, it was a minority that's been convicted?
Well, we've gone from a position where in the first years we were reporting about this and suggesting there was a hidden crime pattern that needed to be acknowledged and then tackled. In those early days, every time we wrote about this, we were accused of racism. The step forward in Newcastle seems to be that finally everybody who speaks on this subject seems to acknowledge that there is a particular issue with a small subsection of men within the South Asian community, predominantly Pakistani Muslim heritage, and it has to start. The hard questions about this have to start. Now, of course, it's hugely difficult for other members of that community for whom such crimes are abhorrent to feel that they are being somehow tarred with the same brush. It's a community that already feels under siege in many ways for issues such as terrorism, etc. And it's always going to be difficult when such questions are asked against a community that feels demonized. But unless we ask those questions, unless we really try to understand why this pattern has put down such deep and damaging roots across the country, then we will never actually understand why these men think they have a right to treat young girls like that in the way they do. All we will be doing is picking up the pieces when the next case comes along, wherever it's going to be in England, picking up the pieces of damaged lives instead of actually taking the action that will prevent these men doing it in the first place.
Well, staying with that theme then, it has been suggested in the past, hasn't it, that this sense of institutional political correctness has really hampered police investigations. Do you think that is the case with investigations like this?
Well, it is inescapable that in a case like the Rotherham scandal, frontline street workers who were working with girls who were suffering these crimes were reporting to their bosses. They were writing reports and they were being told to remove the word Asian as a description of the perpetrators. There was a widespread terror among not just police forces, but within local authority social services department of somehow treading into a cultural minefield. That for too long hampered these crimes being investigated properly. It is a step forward that nobody seems to be denying anymore that there is an issue here.
And what do you make of the criticism that Northumbria police have come under for essentially paying a rapist £10,000 to help solve the case?
I understand that they were very keen, belatedly, to bring these men to justice. I remain utterly astonished that they felt it was morally justifiable to pay £10,000 to a man who had gone with two friends and gang raped a 15-year-old girl in a park, to use that man to provide intelligence about fellow child abusers, that man who was himself going to so-called parties where vulnerable girls were known to be at risk of sexual abuse. For a police force to do that is, in my experience, utterly unprecedented. There have been so many successful prosecutions now, not just the high-profile ones in Rochdale and Rotherham and Oxford, but all over the country. And never, to my knowledge, has a police force dreamt of placing the need to gather evidence ahead of their primary duty, which is child protection and safeguarding. If you know a child is at risk of abuse, you don't sit back and use a child rapist to gather evidence to help your investigation.
OK, Andrew Norfolk, thanks very much for your expertise on that story.
Thank you.
Back here now, and following yesterday's frankly horrific revelation that young girls and women in Newcastle had been groomed and abused for years, today there were demands for such crimes to be treated as racist. From Rotherham to Rochdale, Oxford to Aylesbury, gangs of mainly Asian men have been found guilty of targeting vulnerable white girls. One MP said political correctness had no place in dealing with the problem.
I thought he was my boyfriend. I thought I was cool, grown up, I knew it all.
This woman was groomed and abused from the age of 14, and nearly 20 years later, she is still suffering.
I feel like my life could have been completely different. I wouldn't have been as damaged. It normalised drugs and guns and crime to me, violence, abuse, and that's how my life's been ever since, really.
Yesterday saw the end of a series of trials in Newcastle which jailed 18 people for child sexual exploitation, but ministers now concede this is not a problem limited to any one place.
We've all been appalled to discover the extent of child sex abuse in various parts of the country, and effective police operations, as well as knowledge from within individual communities, is the best way to stop this happening.
Since 2010, at least 6 other sex abuse rings have been exposed. These include Rotherham, where 5 Asian men were jailed and where it's thought there could be up to 1,400 victims. In Rochdale, 9 men from the Pakistani and Afghan communities were convicted for grooming and sex offences in 2012. And in Oxford, a year later, a further 7 men from North Africa and Pakistan were sent to prison. In Bristol, 13 Somali men were convicted in 2014. A year later, 6 Asian men were jailed in Aylesbury. For years since the publication of the J report, which revealed the scale of abuse here, Rotherham has been shaken by the extent of its problem. The town's MP says it's time to face uncomfortable facts about its origins.
Of course, there are many forms of child abuse going on with different makeups, but the actual sort of MO of these people they are British Pakistani men. We need to address it. We can't shy away from that, because for political correctness or fear of being racist or whatever it is, we haven't addressed this problem. We have to address this problem now.
And it's a view that some in the British Pakistani community are now starting to confront.
There is an overrepresentation of Pakistani men. There's no doubt about that, and we have to address the element in the room. Some of these men think that white girls are worthless. They don't have any regard for these girls, and it's that mindset that we've got to confront as a community.
The consequences of exploitation can live with its victims for years. The question now, just who is best placed to prevent it? Damon Green, News at 10, Rotherham.
After Rotherham, Rochdale, Oxford, Derby and quite a few other cases, and now Newcastle, the pattern of street grooming of young girls by gangs of mainly Pakistani or other Asian Muslim origin is well established. Today, Ken MacDonald, a former Director of Public Prosecutions, said it's a disease of racism and sexism that will not abate until it's confronted. Labour MP Sarah Champion said that people are more afraid to be called a racist than they are afraid to be wrong about calling out child abuse, which has inhibited exposure of wrongdoing. She asked, why are we not commissioning research to see what's going on and how we need to change what's going on so that it never happens again? Well, they're good questions, so we're going to ask them for the first part of the programme this evening. However, before we do that, Rabia Limbada reports from Oxford.
Isa Musavi, Muhammad Ali, Nashir Uddin, Monjur Chowdhury, Tahirul Alam, Habibur Rahman, Badrul Hussain, just some of the 18 men and 1 woman who were convicted of abusing girls in Newcastle. The men convicted were mainly British-born and came from Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian, Iraqi, Iranian and Turkish communities. A report in 2011 by the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre identified over 2,000 potential localised grooming offenders. Ethnicity data was only available for 1/3. Of these, 49% were white and 46% Asian. These figures include both group and individual cases of grooming. But they're stark when you consider that the UK Asian population is around 7%.
Emergency. I could hear a woman getting slapped about next door to my room.
A police call made by a guest who was so concerned about what he could hear in the room next door to him at a guest house in Oxford. In 2013, 7 men were jailed for abusing 6 girls in Oxford over an 8-year period. In that case, known as Operation Bullfinch, 2 of the men were of East African origin and 5 Pakistani. A serious case review in 2015 called for research into why a significant proportion of people convicted in these kinds of cases are of Pakistani and/or Muslim heritage. But so far, that research hasn't been forthcoming. The Muslim community in Oxford are still trying to answer those questions themselves.
I think quite often their fathers are very disconnected from what it's like to grow up in England. They've come from back home. And so these boys are trying to navigate themselves through an awful lot of emotions and challenges, and their fathers can't give them the right guidance or the right advice. So they find it elsewhere. And quite often that leads to bad company.
Here in Cowley Road, many of the victims of the grooming gang were picked up. Girls as young as 11 plied with alcohol and drugs and subjected to the most appalling sexual abuse. There have been efforts by community groups and religious leaders to get people to talk openly about what happened, but many say not enough is being done.
We should stop pussyfooting about and say, listen, these are Asian men. These are not Asian, but are they Japanese? Are they Korean? Are they Malaysian? No, they are Muslim of Pakistani extraction, Bangladeshi descent, Turkish connections, whatever. Why are we afraid to say they are Muslim? Why are we being politically correct? And unless we really tackle this head on, we are not going to solve this.
Okay, but whose responsibility is this?
We in the Muslim community have a great responsibility to condemn this in public. For example, there are 2,000 mosques in this country. How many do you think tomorrow will be naming and shaming all of those 17, 18 people?
The biggest challenge now facing the authorities investigating these cases is how to get Muslim communities to trust them enough to tell them what's happening in their midst.
Rabia Limbarda, well, as you heard, the statistics say that Asians are about 50% more likely to be convicted of a sexual offence than the rest of the population. For street grooming offences, more specifically, the disproportion is much higher. But before we move on, a quick statistical point, because it's dodgy to make ethnic or religious generalisations comparing Muslims and non-Muslims, say, on the basis of tiny populations of offenders. Even if a Muslim man was 10 times more likely to be convicted of a sexual offence than a non-Muslim, which he's not, the numbers are low in both groups. So you're literally talking about comparing a population that is 99.996% non-offending with a population that is 99.96% non-offending. So few people offend in both groups, you can double the number in one group and it makes little difference to the group overall. So you have to be careful about sweeping judgments on the differences between those groups. However, that being said, a lot of people think that the numbers understate important cultural characteristics of different religions and that the Muslim community more widely has problems to deal with. So with me now, there's a panel exclusively Muslim to work through some of those issues. The anti-extremism campaigner, Anira Kokar, the founder of British Muslim Youth, Mobeen Hussain, the filmmaker Mobeen Azhar, and Sabah Zaman, a journalist based in Bristol. A very good evening to you all. I want to start by finding whether we're framing this okay by saying we're having a Muslim panel discussing what is essentially a Muslim problem. Mobeen, do you recognise that as a problem?
No, I think we are framing it incorrectly. I think we've had a guy just come on in the earlier piece say, well, it's not Japanese or these kind of different cultures. Islam is a religion of all cultures. You find Japanese Muslims, you find Indonesian Muslims. In fact, the largest Muslim population in the world is in Indonesia. And to say somehow, you know, this is somehow a Muslim problem. Let's look at these grooming gangs. These grooming gangs were individuals that were using alcohol, using drugs, and actually having sessions exploiting these young girls. I don't know what's Islamic about drinking alcohol, drugs, and exploiting young girls.
So you want to separate it definitely from the religion. Do the rest of you feel the same as Mobeen? Sabah?
I think Mobeen definitely has a fair point. In this particular case, there are cultural parallels that are being made and religious parallels. Generally, I think across the media, generally, no religious parallel has particularly been made. So I think in your intro is quite interesting. What I do find interesting, the fact that we have an all-exclusive Muslim panel here. But this situation is not just exclusive to Muslim communities, it's across all communities, but therefore it doesn't mean it doesn't happen and it does need to be addressed.
Right. Mobeen, what do you feel?
Yeah, there's a thing here, there's a pattern that reoccurs whenever this happens. I'm sure you guys can relate to this. When you hear these stories breaking, you wince when you hear Muslim names. And as a community, we are really uncomfortable and we're really used to reacting. We're really used to reacting and saying, this has got nothing to do with us, it's nothing to do with our community. And I don't think anyone in their right mind would say this is a theological issue. They're doing this because they're good Muslims. Of course, no one would say that. Having said that, we have to acknowledge that sex and sexuality and gender and respect for the opposite gender are issues within certain parts of the diaspora. That's the South Asian community, the Arab community, and large sections of the Muslim community. These are things that we have to discuss in our communities, and we've seen this pattern, you know, in Newcastle and in Rotherham, and we can't shy away from these issues.
Right. I'll go back to you, Mobeen, on that. Do you agree with that? So it's a slightly different way of framing it, but do you buy what the other Mobeen has said?
Partially, I think we have to look at this, but recognise we dealing with it. Let me give you a clear image of what actually happened in Rotherham. When the Rotherham grooming scandal came about, British Muslim youth organised the first ever demonstration against these criminals that were claiming to be from our community. Right. We came out and demonstrated. You'll never see the far right come out against Jimmy Savile. I've not seen the EDL come outside the BBC studios. But the point I'm trying to make is, look, we have people coming out. In fact, it was a Pakistani man in Rochdale that recognised these people as victims, and it came out.
Let me bring Anira in and help us out, Anira, sort of between these different interpretations of how we frame the problem. Where are you?
I think the labelling is incorrect. I don't think it's a Muslim problem, as the rest of the panel have suggested. And we happen to be Muslims, as Sabah said, which it would have been nice to have other religions, because it's not just the Muslim community, apparently, that has this issue. We've seen many cases where there's been white groups that have been grooming, and there has been young children being raped, but we don't label them as white Christian grooming gangs. We label them by name, or we label them as just a group. And I think it's unfair that that's not the same. These are criminals at the end of the day, you know, and they should be treated like that.
But I think even if they weren't, as I've seen across the board generally, the media hasn't actually called it out as a Muslim-specific case in this particular case today.
We've got a panel of 4 Muslims.
Yes, which is what I mentioned earlier. But I also think even if it's not, due to the names and the cultural associations, there are cultural assumptions that are made when there are people from certain communities with certain names and backgrounds, and this is from the South Asian diaspora. Yeah. So it's quite hard to separate that. Right. There is that dichotomy does exist.
Can I ask you, Mabeen, start us off on this, about the cultural issues, attitudes towards sex. You kind of raised this.
Yeah,
because you clearly think there is a bit of an issue, and I'd like to hear what the issue is.
I made a programme I think it was about a year ago, called The Muslim Sex Doctor, and I spent time shadowing an imam who was working in this field. And he was very open. He would tell me and I know this and you guys must know this from within the Pakistani community, there are issues in terms of the narrow definition of the kind of women who deserve respect. This is a cultural thing, it's not a religious thing, but culturally we'll use this word izzat, that means honour, and we will say, you know, a woman who is wearing the hijab, who cooks and cleans, who is the queen of the home, she deserves respect. Now, what happens then when you have people who are raised in those environments and they get jobs as taxi drivers and they're working in takeaways and they join the nighttime economy? Yeah. The nighttime economy is an ongoing theme in all these cases. You have these men who've grown up in this climate who all of a sudden are face to face with women who don't fit that model. So women who might like a drink, or women who wear short skirts, or who are quite loud. And that doesn't fit with their definition of a person that deserves respect. That is a problem. You have to address that.
And just following on from what Mubeen said, I think there is an issue within not just the Pakistani, but the South Asian community in terms of women having that level of respect. So, for example, you know, in a family, let's just say there's a son and there's a daughter. The son will be allowed to go outside, stay out till about 10 o'clock, you know, possibly have a girlfriend, whereas the girls have to stay at home. Now, if you are bringing children up in that kind of mindset, they only know that they have to respect that individual in their house, mother, daughter.
I think that could be a sweeping generalisation as well.
Yeah, but I do think that this is something that the Pakistani community, the South Asian community need to look into, because, as you said, the word honour is a burden on girls mainly, and so they have to live with that. Anything they do is reflective on the whole family and the community, and I don't think it's fair.
No, it is. There is an issue of izzat, but let's look at it and let's not conflate one issue with another issue. There are these men, and we're talking about a criminal mindset of individuals who, like people like Jimmy Savile, live two lifestyles. On the one lifestyle, they live a very public lifestyle where they want to show themselves as being good community members, and they do that. But at the same time, when people say they only see certain women as fair game, let's be honest, if you look at the J report, and Apna Hack did findings on the J report, they found 150 young girls out of the 1,400 were Pakistani girls. The problem is that these people aren't differentiating, because they're sick men, between white girls and Muslim girls or Pakistani girls, but Pakistani girls, due to izzat and honour, are finding it very difficult to speak out. These are very sick men.
Difficult to speak out. I'm glad you raised that, because Sabah, help me out on this. Is there an issue around the ability to converse or to come forward and say, I've been attacked or I've been abused, or have been raped within the Muslim community. Forget the white girl issue. Or
so I can talk about the South Asian community, diaspora in general, because it exists, and it's not just Muslims, it's the Hindu, Sikhs and other faith communities, because I'm also from that community. From the first generational perspective, it's been something that we don't necessarily talk about because there is the concept of honour. But it is changing, and this group...
Is it?
It is changing because there are practitioners on the ground and who are actually working with women. And like I said, it's not just an exclusive Muslim issue or a South Asian issue, but there is sometimes, generally from the first generation, that it was slightly difficult. There is a sense of, keeping the honour of the community or protecting women, not because we're therefore protecting the men, but that's how it folds out. But
and so it's basically covering up crime or burying crime.
Yes,
because
or how to deal with it.
Yeah.
But then in the Rotherham case, we know that the community did go forward and speak to the police, and the police didn't speak to them. I didn't speak to the victims either. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. However, I also do agree that the police does need the help from the community, and we also need to be active, and we also need to address these issues ourselves.
Completely. I think it is changing, but it's achingly slow. And what I mean by that, and again, I'm sure you guys can relate, growing up I grew up in Huddersfield in Yorkshire. I went to mosque regularly. I know that my experiences did not match up with the conversations at the mosque. So if you are a young man and you want to talk about contraception, or you want to talk about certain feelings, or you just want to talk about sex, you're not going to get that guidance from the mosque. That's
the last place. I mean, because that's a religious place.
And also, not just in terms of it being a religious place, but also in terms of, look at the state of our mosques. The majority of them still today are run by imams who don't even speak the local language.
But they don't also say go out and groom young girls.
No, of course they don't. But what I'm saying though, this is really important. If you are raised in an environment where you can't talk about things like sex, that is going to lead to problems.
I also think that's a cultural dichotomy.
It's entirely cultural.
It's not necessarily going back to the point that
I think we're all agreed. Actually, I think you made that there's a cultural. If there's a problem, it's cultural.
Yes, yeah.
But the question is let's pin down what this cultural problem is. I
also think it's.
I've not said it's a culture.
No. What I mean, I'm trying to. We've ruled out religion at least, but at least some are arguing.
I think
it's
from
cultural.
my own experiences, one issue that I personally have not only come across on a personal level, but also have seen as I've been working nationally, is the fact that sometimes the police does worry about community tensions. And so they are not willing to always go in and talk to the community and talk to the community leaders, who I call self-appointed, most of them are self-appointed leaders, and actually discuss things that are happening.
But that is the argument, effectively, that political correctness gets in the way of policing or enforcing or sorting out some of these problems.
Evan, I'm going to have to come in here. I think that's the biggest lie that's ever told, the biggest excuse. You ask any Pakistani male going into an airport whether they don't stop and search them because of racism, you'll get more likely to be stopped and searched. And that's preconditioned thinking that this individual may be a criminal. So there's no racism in that. There's no racism in Pakistani drug dealers. Why is there racism in this? I'll tell you why. Because we've been fighting this case for 3 years with South Yorkshire Police, and only now have South Yorkshire Police admitted there was no political correctness in the Rotherham issue, and there was their own internal failings. Because what happened is that these officers did not believe these young girls because they were from working class backgrounds.
Right. No, and that problem is widely recognised.
Just to say it's racism. Why are you stopping and searching Pakistani males like never before in airports? You're not racist then.
Can I ask whether, because a lot of people think part of the solution to all of this is going to be for a much more open conversation, more brutally honest conversation, more openness within the community, between communities. But that is going to mean sometimes things like this. We're going to gather Muslims round and we're going to say, is there a Muslim issue?
I don't think we're going to gather Muslims round. I think that's very colloquial to say that.
But I know, but what I'm saying is, do you welcome that at all? Or does that in a way scare you?
I completely do. And I think the idea of gathering Muslims around, I think we're starting to see, for example, this imam that I shadowed, he was organising conferences to talk about sex. That's practically unheard of within the Muslim community. I think that's a really great thing to do. But
Saba, do you
the Muslim
agree?
community has to lead on that, and it's just started to happen.
Saba?
I think it is important, definitely, but I also think, we have various voices from various communities, but as we're not all representatives, we're a huge diaspora and we're communities, and we can only speak as individuals, but like I said earlier, there is a change. But I would like to also make a parallel a parallel kind of
very briefly,
you know,
very briefly.
where when we, and I know we've ruled out faith earlier on, and you know, when we talk about the Islamic context, we talk about Islam is a sense of justice. So this isn't even about an Islamic context; it's about young girls getting justice for a crime that's committed against them. Just as if the church, when it comes to bishops and them grooming young boys, I mean, that's not necessarily, that's the same paradigm and the same sense of.
We need to leave it there. We've started this conversation. I really appreciate you all coming in and having it. Thank you very much indeed.